It's the week ending Saturday the 11th of December, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen government spokeswoman Allegra Stratton resigning after being caught on camera joking about a lockdown Christmas party at number 10, Myanmar's ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi sentenced to 4 years in jail for inciting unrest and violating COVID restrictions, and the banning of unvaccinated fans from Adele's show in Las Vegas. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Sorcha Bradley and Julia O'Driscoll, plus from the daily history podcast, The Retrospectors, which I can tell you has a wonderful forthcoming episode on the woman who broke the record for speed-eating mayonnaise. It's Arion McNicoll. And Arion, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that the recruitment of child soldiers is on the march.
But were designated as a terrorist organization in the 90s. In 2016, FARC signed a peace deal with the government to bring more than 50 years of war to an end. But not all of the fighters laid down their weapons. Thousands stay in the jungle rearming themselves under the same name while recruiting new blood to continue fighting.
Guillermo Galdos reporting for Channel 4 News back in March on the scourge of child soldiers. Arion, what's happened this week?
Yeah, so this week the magazine Foreign Policy published an article about how the recruitment of child soldiers into armed groups in Colombia during the pandemic has really soared. And basically a perfect storm has been brewing in Colombia due to the emergence of new armed groups in the country on the one hand, together with the closure of schools and economic deprivation brought about by the pandemic, and all of this together has fueled this massive rise in recruitment. And Colombia's government reported that hundreds of children were recruited between 2016 and 2020, but even those numbers are thought to be a huge underestimate. And the article was released just as Morocco's permanent representative at the UN, Omar Halale, made a speech to the Security Council in New York calling recruitment of children by insurgent groups one of the most serious violations of human rights that's going on today, and one that needs urgently to be addressed by the international community.
Okay, but do you think it is going to be urgently addressed? Do you think Halale's intervention means there will be increased international attention on this? Because it does seem pretty cyclical. It's not a new problem, is it?
Yeah, it does seem a difficult one, and especially in Colombia where, the most prolific recruiters are these armed groups who have kind of spun out of what was the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, often called FARC, and the new group is known as the Carlos Patino Front, and it really emerged after that 2016 deal between the Colombian government and the FARC, and they've gone on this massive recruitment drive just to fill the space that was left behind by those criminal groups. But it seems like the problems are huge internationally. That's a sort of microcosm of the thing that we're seeing all over the world.
Okay, so how do you go on a recruitment drive of child soldiers, Sorcha? How do you sign them up?
Well, as Arion was just saying, the pandemic has massively driven recruitment. And that partly is because so many children aren't in schools anymore. And in rural areas in Colombia, they have very little access to internet. Teachers can't provide virtual classes, and so children are out of school and getting very little contact with kind of school authorities and things like that. Also, Colombia is in economic crisis, and so these groups like FARC or FARC dissidents supposedly offer higher salaries. They lure children in with offers of up to $1,000 a month and access to motorcycles, cell phones, and also having status within the community is also sometimes a draw.
But in some examples I saw, Julia, nothing more really than a hot meal is being proposed to lure children away from their families.
I think that really speaks to just how desperate the situation is for children in these areas that are particularly being targeted at the moment. And as Arion was saying, it's kind of this perfect storm that has arisen over the course of the pandemic. But also, in some cases, families are being threatened with violence themselves. And as a way to protect kind of the rest of their family members, children are recruited into these gangs.
Yeah, and we should talk about the primary purpose of these kids, which is often bluntly, Arion, to be human body bags, really. They're sent off to the front line, right?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that go on. One is that they're given basic training with weapons and then sent off to be cannon fodder, as you say. But then some children are also drawn into picking cocoa, which is this really difficult task that's quite well suited to children's smaller hands. And then also for girls who are brought into the groups, they are often used to lure in male recruits or as informants or even paid militants themselves sometimes. But, you know, as Julia was saying, part of the problem is that it's not just the children who are being targeted with inducement of food or sweets or mobile phones or whatever it is, but also people's parents who are actively threatened often. And the FARC dissidents themselves often paint people's houses with graffiti saying you have X many hours to leave the village or we will kill you. So it's both carrot and stick that's being used here.
Yeah, I mean, Julia, when it comes to something like coca, that's a product with a supply chain, isn't it? So, you know, when people who are listening to this are thinking, well, I don't live in Colombia, what's this got to do with me? You know, this is very sad, but what can I do about it? I suppose there is a responsibility on perhaps some of the companies that people listening to this work for to see whether somewhere down the line there are child soldiers involved.
Absolutely. And this is a problem with these kind of massive globalized supply chains as well, is that regulating safety either for workers and identifying who those workers might be is a massive problem for companies. And I think another point on that one is that it's really difficult as well to establish just how many children are child soldiers or are involved in these kind of activities. People say that estimates are very difficult to pull just because of fear of obviously further persecution from dissidents. So it's very difficult to know, though the Colombian government said last year that it estimated around 460 children had been recruited in 2020, but people say that that estimate is wildly low and probably the true number is much, much higher.
And what happens to these child soldiers when they become adults, Sorcha?
Child soldiers, I think, unsurprisingly, often suffer from PTSD and other mental health issues, which in turn can make it extremely difficult for children when and if they ever are released to reintegrate back into their communities. And reintegration is incredibly important, not only because morally we should reintegrate children back into their communities, but also in order to create sustainable peace in these countries where there are ongoing conflicts in which child soldiers are used. It's incredibly important that they can re-enter their communities in a safe way and that they're free of further kind of stigmatization and they're safe from prosecution. That's often an issue as well. And if children who have been soldiers can't do that, then you can see essentially a reversal of the peace process in those countries, and any gains that have been made are kind of completely negated. So it's really important that we tackle kind of the mental health effects as well.
Yeah, and the other obvious thing that can happen, as well as all of those mental health things, is that child soldiers become adult soldiers. And in February this year, the International Criminal Court convicted Dominic Ongwen, who was a commander of the Ugandan Lord's Resistance Army rebels and a former child soldier himself. And, you know, he was convicted of dozens of crimes, including child abductions and murder and this recruitment drive. So you can see how there's a sort of cycle of people being recruited as children and then going on to do the recruiting as adults.
But I mean, Julia, Sorcha there was just advocating for immunity from prosecution, which, you know, makes sense if you commit a crime as a child and you've been essentially drawn into doing that under duress. But at the same time, immunity from prosecution is exactly the reason why, if you're someone gathering around children, you would want them on your front line, isn't it? Like they can do things that break international laws and there is no repercussion for them.
I suppose that might be true, but obviously, as Sorcha was also saying, the repercussion is huge for children who want to reintegrate with their communities. You know, employment opportunities, economic opportunities kind of disappear for these children, and without kind of the right kinds of support, there isn't really a future forward.
Yeah, but how do we crack the nut, though? Because the global community can say, oh, this is a very bad thing. I mean, no one here is going to say it's a great thing to have child soldiers, obviously. But it is already an international war crime to do so. FARC is already seen as a terrorist organisation. So what actually can be done?
Yeah, so Morocco's representative of the UN, Halale, who I mentioned earlier, you know, his campaign is very much to prioritise all of those really difficult and complex things like education, food, and health and safety for these vulnerable kids in these areas. And there was a study that came out last week by Save the Children that found that 1 in 8 kids worldwide, terrifyingly, 337 million children are living near armed groups and potentially in the line for recruiters to pick them up and turn them into child soldiers. That obviously doesn't mean that all 300 million of them are going to become child soldiers, but the threat is very great. And I think that what at least Halale believes is that, you know, you need to install the sorts of policies that protect children and stop them from being vulnerable in the first place.
That same Save the Children report also was calling for more cooperation from the international community as well. So talking about the need to uphold UN protocols for the rights of children, which call for a straight 18 recruitment for anybody involved in kind of armed conflict, but also looking at regulating and improving transparency around arms transfers and delivery, and also using national systems to target the perpetrators of the violence. So looking at freezing bank accounts, imposing travel bans, trying to create these kind of global networks that can work together to prevent the problem in the first place as well, by reducing the level of conflict threat.
I mean, the point is, I suppose, Sorcha, that a lot of the countries that we're talking about here, not just Colombia, but, you know, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, are places that are in total disarray. So trying to increase the transparency of arms deliveries is just, I mean, it's a worthwhile cause, but it's almost impossible.
Yeah, I think kind of ending the use of child soldiers is incredibly complex. And we can sit here and talk about the different paths that have been suggested, but I think often the international community doesn't really get it right. May I gently suggest, for example, the case of Shamima Begum comes up. I think under the Save the Children's definition of what a child soldier is, she would certainly qualify. And yet there's almost no sympathy for her in Britain. And, you know, as we were just talking about, one of the kind of ideas behind integration is that proper reintegration, which has not been called for in the case of Shamima Begum at all. She hasn't been allowed to return to the UK. But one of the principles is that children who have been forced into these situations, and she was 15, should be primarily considered as victims. As we were just saying, that hasn't happened in her case. So I think, you know, they are actually incredibly thorny issues, even though it seems on the surface very clear cut.
Okay, Sorcha, you're up next after this. Sorcha, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week we asked, will women ever win pay parity in the UK?
So, you know, it's gone down over the past 25 years. But if we actually look at the scale here, you know, the level is still pretty remarkable at 40%. And it's essentially only fallen 14% over the past quarter century, 14 percentage points.
Alison Andrew presenting for the Institute for Fiscal Studies on Monday. Sorcha, what's the story?
The gender pay gap has seen barely any change over the past 25 years once increases in women's education are accounted for, says a new report from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So the report says that it's only because women's attainment in education has increased that there has been any progress at all in closing the gap. So the earnings gap is 40%, which is 25% lower than it was 25 years ago. But that is incredibly modest progress from what we should expect, especially when we take into account that women are now 5 percentage points more likely to have a university degree than men. So in essence, what this kind of really means is policy changes, kind of societal changes, economic changes haven't really been enough to close the gap.
But it's heading in the right direction. I suppose it's a question about the amount of time that it's taking to get to the destination that most people want, which is parity. What does this study suggest we'd be looking at if no further, intervention was taken? Would it just remain at 40% forever?
The gap is decreasing slowly, but as this report kind of highlights, the things that are in play at the moment in terms of government policy, in terms of societal attitudes, that hasn't really made a difference. And so unless we kind of really make big changes to government policy, have big turnarounds in kind of societal attitudes, then yes, essentially this pay gap will stay at roughly the same level that it is at now.
Except the thing that's happened recently, Julia, is this pressure for larger companies to publish their gender pay gap and essentially hoping to embarrass them into parity in the future. That might yet have an effect, might it not?
It might, but it still feels like it's a long way off, I would say. And I think that even though these reports are being published and the information is now more widely available, I mean, I was trying to get my head around this fiscal studies report, and it took me a really long time to unpick the numbers and really make sense of it. So there's the fact that this is quite a complex issue to unpick anyway, but also that I would say it's not necessarily being talked about in the workplace as well. There are these reports happening, but today in the workplace, salary conversations still often take place either behind closed doors, or people are slightly uncertain or guessing at what other people might earn, rather than kind of a more transparent approach. I think there's quite an interesting approach that some startups, and particularly tech startups, have approached in recent years, this open salary approach. So in kind of Silicon Valley, people will start a meeting by introducing themselves, saying what their role is and saying what their salary is. And when there's total transparency in the room, people find that those firms do have a much lower gender pay gap, which I think is kind of maybe a more radical approach, and probably one I don't think we'd see in the UK anytime soon. But I think it gives real food for thought on how can these issues be addressed far more progressively.
But it's not, is it, that men and women are being paid differently for the same jobs, right? Because that's illegal. That's discrimination. So it is that basically, I mean, to really dilute it, there are more male executives. There are more men at a top level than there are women. And then you come back to those societal issues, as Sorcha put it, Arion, which can be quite complex, don't they? It doesn't necessarily mean men are forcing women, because it often comes to childcare, to stay at home and look after children. It is that a lot of women want to do that. And so do you want to engineer it too much?
I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's the business of parental leave and who takes it that continues to be one of the major problems. And there's a new book by Claudia Golden from Harvard University called Career and Family: Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equality that was picked up on by The Economist. And it really charted the way in which women's journey has gone from the home to the workplace. And she says the first generation that she studied, who were born between 1878 and 97, contained plenty of working women, but a successful career in that era required pretty much just foregoing children altogether. And among the notable women from that time, in this collection of biographies called Notable American Women, only 3 in 10 during that period had a child. So you really have to skip forward to the fifth group that she studies that were born in 1958. And that group of women was really the first who could aspire to achieve both career and family. And the shift, according to Golden at least, was aided by the invention of the contraceptive pill, which helped women delay marriage in the first place, and then improved fertility treatments, which helped them delay childbearing. And then sort of more liberal gender norms in general. But the pay gap still exists. And what she says, further to all of this, apart from all of this parental pressure, is the existence of things she calls greedy jobs. And greedy jobs are those roles like in law and accountancy and finance that demand long and very unpredictable hours that are really non-commensurate with people who need to be on call if their child falls ill or if they need picking up from school or whatever. And parental groups usually agree, if they are in line for these sorts of jobs, that one of the parents may consider taking a greedy job while the other parent continues to do the traditional role of parenting. And that role continues to fall very heavily on women. So it really is, as you say, the impact of parenting that's underpinning quite a lot of this.
So I suppose the question is, why does it continue to fall so heavily on women, Sorcha? Is it choice, as I'm positing in my friendship group? That doesn't mean that's representative, does it? You know, middle-class people who both have decent jobs and then the women choose to do work when they get pregnant when they're in their late 30s is not necessarily that representative of sample. I'm sure there are many women who felt forced out of the workplace.
So kind of this hypothesis, which Arion was just talking about, that couples prioritise the most highly paid parent, and that's often why, you know, women reduce their hours at work or take less highly paid jobs. This report from the IFS shows that that kind of hypothesis doesn't really bear out. And that's partly because it's found that women are always more likely to stop working once they become a mother, whether or not they were the highest earner. And they're also kind of more likely to reduce their working hours, whereas for men, there's barely any change in kind of either in pay or in working hours. So that kind of suggests that it all makes economic sense. That's why women earn less, because you have to kind of prioritize one, breadwinner. That isn't really the case. It's more that there are kind of other societal factors at play where women feel that they should be, for whatever reason, very complex reasons, that they should be spending time at home raising their children while they're very young. And actually, there's also evidence to suggest that there is actually a very real penalty for women in the workplace in terms of motherhood. And there's a link between the more people in an area think that women should look after their children while they're young, the less that they are paid in the workplace and the bigger the wage gap. So there are these kind of huge societal factors at play as well. It's not just kind of these economic arguments which are often made.
But would that necessarily, Julia, be seen as progress if a situation like that was forced in the UK? Responding to a story about women being disadvantaged by forcing women back into the workplace sooner after childbirth and giving men more paid time off by saying, you can't transfer your paternity leave. That doesn't feel like something that feminists are going to celebrate.
I think as well it's notable that countries with a lower gender pay gap often have more affordable childcare, and they also have policies in place that say that parental leave can't be transferred to the mother. So fathers have statutory parental leave that they also have to take. So I think, these wider societal issues aren't the same globally, and the UK could definitely, make progress by looking to other countries' examples.
It's interesting, isn't it? We're talking about return to the workplace, Arion. Here we are following government guidelines on Zoom this morning. And, these figures are from 2019. They are from a pre-pandemic world that the IFS are analysing. Do you think the pandemic, working from home, might have changed the situation?
Possibly, but if anything, probably for the worse. And other studies looking at the ways that remote working impacts people across the genders is that it tends to disadvantage women more than it does men. And that's in part because, And that's in part because women, there still is an expectation that women do more of the house and home kind of and parental work than men, even if they have got their own complete careers in the first place.
Even if they're, say, recording a current affairs weekly podcast at the same time.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but also then you have the added complication of the fact that women have tended historically, even prior to the pandemic, to do more flexible work than men and more part-time work, partly as a product of the expectations of being a mother. But now that people are starting to go back to the office, though in a spluttering stop-start way, those advantages that we've speculated upon massively in this podcast about being in the office and the sort of the getting ahead that happens by water cooler conversation and the sort of idle networking that exists in a workplace scenario is reaching men more than it's reaching women. And so yet another way that women are being disadvantaged here.
Yeah, I mean, even aside from the gender issue on that, Sorcha, I've seen some commentary this week around this subject that we might be heading towards a permanent so-called two-track system, that basically you're working from home track or you're in the office track, and the people in the office, men or women, but more likely to be men, are always going to have the advantage because they have that networking time, they have that face time, and the work from home track of graduates is going to be disadvantaged for the whole of their careers.
Yeah, I think in terms of people who are working at home because they have lots of childcare responsibilities, which is often the majority of the time women, it's another way in which kind of society and the workplace doesn't really recognise or value these non-paid roles that women spend a lot of their time doing. And if that was more highly valued or even kind of considered as normal and something that a lot of the population has to do, then there wouldn't be such a kind of penalty for taking on these non-paid roles, which come with, a lot of societal expectation. And if we kind of had move to more inclusive workplaces where those childcare responsibilities were recognised, then pay parity and the number of women kind of in executive C-suite roles, I think we would see a massive uptick in women in those roles.
And the gender pay gap is only the tip of the iceberg, isn't it, Julia? I mean, we've got disparities based upon ethnicity, for non-binary people, for people who are disabled to think about as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's also important to note that people aren't just working from home due to childcare arrangements as well. There are so many reasons. And if we want to look at alleviating pay gaps in a truly inclusive way, I think there's a lot of space that needs to be addressed. There's currently no legal requirement for companies to publish ethnicity pay gaps. And also the government guidelines say that employers can omit non-binary employees' pay details from gender pay gap calculations, which I think is also quite shocking, because that just leaves potentially a whole group of workers where we don't really know what's happening in terms of their pay as well.
Okay, Julia, we're going to hear something totally different from you after this. Julia, you're finishing the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
First, Machu Picchu, then the Vatican City, and now Berghain?
The techno parties did not stop. They started 11 o'clock till in the morning 6, 7, 8, 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock. Sometimes there were parties like 36 hours. People want to escape from the real world, from the reality. It's like a therapy. They want to enter this door and want to find a world they really like,
Real Scenes Berlin, a 2011 documentary from YouTube channel Resident Advisor. Julia, what's the story?
So this week, DJs, festival organisers and music fans have come together under the community Rave the Planet to enter a bid to get Berlin's techno scene protection under UNESCO. So this isn't quite like Machu Picchu or the Vatican City. The campaigners are applying for a specific type of protection under the category of intangible cultural heritage. So this typically covers different domains, including oral traditions, performing arts and traditional craftsmanship. They're typically slightly more obscure areas of cultural heritage, but Jamaican reggae has been awarded this level of protection. And so now these campaigners are looking to see if they can do the same for Berlin's techno scene.
I mean, very interesting, thinking of techno as sort of Berliner folk music. But at the same time, not necessary, you'd think. I mean, it's commercially successful, isn't it? You mentioned Berghain, one of the biggest nightclubs in the world. People go to Berlin for techno music. Why do you need UNESCO to recognise it when it's making money? People know it exists.
So inevitably, COVID has had a really awful impact on Berlin's nightclub scene, and particularly the techno scene, with club closures, and there's been significant financial losses. And clubs in Berlin are awarded a certain level of protection because they are recognised by the German government as cultural institutions, which does award them some level of tax breaks. But through gaining this certain type of UNESCO protection, they would be able to apply for further government subsidies and other routes of funding as well.
Sorcha, if you were sitting on the UNESCO panel, how do you think you'd review this application?
I think it's great. I fully support. Techno music has been such an important part of Berlin's cultural heritage, especially kind of after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Going to these kind of hugely famous nightclubs was, a really important part of kind of uniting East and West Berliners. I think it's incredibly important. I'd like to kind of see that happen in the UK with some of our kind of musical output as well. I think we are having similar problems in London with kind of clubs closing, and if I was on the kind of panel, I fully support it.
But doesn't it kill the vibe, Arion? I mean, we've spoken on the Retrospectors actually in an episode about the 1994 Criminal Justice Act, what the reaction here in Britain was to counterculture rave parties, which was essentially the government banning dance music for a while. In Germany, it's been embraced a bit, but it's its very alternativeness, isn't it, that keeps those people coming to Berlin. Once you make it a UNESCO thing, aren't you taking the fun away?
I know what you mean, and you consider the fact that last year Germany's financial high court ruled that techno was a genre of music. It's just so peculiar to have such a thing as a financial court ruling on such an issue in the first place. But the point of it was to allow nightclubs in Berlin and across Germany to take advantage of tax cuts. And I think that's what this is all about when you come down to it. Well, it's about two things. It's about trying to get these venues the support that they need, including via lower taxes and access to state support from the government. But it's also a story about the changing face of a city in the first place. You know, in the 1990s, Berlin still conjured up thoughts of kind of the Second World War for many Europeans, but since then it really has become this creative hub where low costs of living and lots of, alternative culture had encouraged people to move there. And tens of thousands of people have been moving to Berlin every year, with the exception, I gather, of 2020, just when people were less mobile in general. But increasingly, finding an apartment is becoming as tricky as it is in New York or in London. And I think, you're also getting these problems for the existing clubs that they're struggling to pay their rising rents. And that's why you're seeing this massive amount of club closures, which actually would be normal in other cities. Clubs do tend to have a high turnover, but there was this quote in the Observer article that I read about this issue from Alan Oldham, who's a DJ from Detroit who now lives in Berlin. And he said, so many clubs have closed in just the 7 years that he has lived there, and that would be normal in other cities. But he said Berlin is a different kind of place where the club and the creative scenes are the currency of the city. And I think that's the significant thing that wants to be supported here.
How do Germans feel about it, Julia? And I say Germans rather than Berliners because, by self-definition, as we've just been explaining, if they've arrived in Berlin, they probably quite like this sort of thing. But do you think Germans in general like the idea that Berlin is this sort of alternative capital of the world?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I also, to refute the kind of point of does this tarnish the whole vibe, I think I'd be more concerned about that if it weren't for the fact that it is the city's DJs, musicians and fans who are putting forward this campaign. But in terms of the country on the whole, I would assume that Germany would be quite pro this kind of new face of kind of German culture. The techno scene is known to be inclusive and forward-looking, and I think that's a really positive thing for a country. And particularly, they've attracted a lot of tourists to Berlin just through these huge clubs, but in a way that, people still don't feel that that is necessarily ruining the vibe as well. I think that by affording this kind of UNESCO protection, it could also prevent further threats of gentrification as well.
What's the deal, though, if a new club opened up? Like if I wanted to go and open Olly's techno party zone, would that be protected by the ICH?
No one's going to protect that, Olly.
I was disowning it the moment it came out of my mouth. But does this only apply to the big clubs?
I think the business of support from UNESCO would lend a hand in all of these ways that would encourage the state to give clubs the kind of tax breaks that might help to protect them. But it is worth noting that even UNESCO recognition isn't a one-way process. And you look at how even earlier this year, Liverpool had its UNESCO status revoked for it having allowed years of development to really blight its Victorian docks, which were the bit of the city that were being protected in the first place. So, it's not a guarantee, even when you get this status, that the thing that you're trying to protect will continue to be looked after. So that has to happen internally. It's a sort of external sort of recognition of something that's important, but I think you do need that sort of national effort to support the clubs happening internally as well.
It is something those initial ravers from the 80s, Sorcha, would have found laughable, isn't it? This idea that in 2021 it's being discussed as something worth protecting by the United Nations.
I think, this kind of happens with all forms of music. Eventually, all kind of countercultures and different forms of transgressive music, rock and roll, for example, becomes mainstream eventually. I think a really good comparison to make kind of now in the UK and London is grime, which was once kind of completely derided and even, seen as dangerous. Whereas now Stormzy is one of our biggest cultural exports, one of our most kind of famous stars. And he has very much entered the mainstream. Although they may laugh, this is kind of the natural progression of of kind of music, and it's worth protecting.
I think as well, something that a lot of the campaigners and the DJ that Arion mentioned earlier, Alan Oldman, kind of point to is also this kind of symbolism that certain types of music genres have around them. And I think particularly with techno, it's not to sound like a huge techno fan, but it is more than just the music. It is this entire community. And Oldman said UNESCO protection would help a lot towards establishing techno and club culture as a legitimate social force with historical value and worthy of government support, not just hedonistic, disposable club music and drugs, which I think is another also a really important point to think about as well, that there's a lot about the finances and what this means on a kind of global and international stage in terms of music, but also just kind of in a slightly more romanticized sense, the symbolism of it as well.
It's also not going to be an instant thing either. DJ Motte, who is one of the people who's leading the campaign, said that it's going to take between 2 and 10 years to get that final outcome. So, even taking into account Sorcha's enthusiasm for the endorsement of the UNESCO panel, I think that that this isn't something that we're going to see resolved immediately. And perhaps that's right, considering that the other things that are on the list include stuff like watchmaking in Switzerland and hurling in Ireland and pizza making in Italy. These are things that take a long time to grow, and their establishment as cultural phenomenons that are significant both to the nation itself and to the world is something that also might take a bit of time to establish. So yeah, it's not surprising in a sense that this might be a long story rather than a short one.
Well, just like any hardcore rave, this podcast now needs to be shut down immediately. My thanks to Arion, Julia and Sorcha for being on the beat for every story. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, tap go to podcast and then tap follow now. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.